So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Language Advocacy Day 2025. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, before we jump in, as you can see, my name is Sarah Onyango, and I will be your moderator. I myself am a translator, so this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I'm also a radio and TV host, so everything I do involves language practice. Stories that advocate, embracing the role of a language ally. This is a virtual event celebrating Language Advocacy Day, aimed at promoting language diversity and rights. LAD seeks to raise awareness about issues related to language access in Canada and encourages policymakers to implement supportive policies. This year focuses on developing strategies to become effective language allies. We uphold that language rights are human rights, and we are committed to ensuring equitable access for all languages. By sharing personal experiences and narratives, we illustrate the real-world implications of language access barriers and inspire action. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first storyteller, Leah Riddell. Leah is a bilingual, inclusive educator, ASL instructor, and advocate for accessible communication. She empowers individuals and organizations to embrace effective communication practices, celebrating the richness of ASL culture and building meaningful connections in schools, workplaces, and communities. Please join me in welcoming Leah Riddell.
Awesome. So hello, my name is Leah Riddell and my name sign is an L on the shoulder. I'm very honored to be here with you today. I am a white woman with short brown hair. I do have some silver highlights. Maybe you can see them, maybe not. I'm wearing glasses and I'm wearing a green short sleeve shirt. My background consists, it's not like the others just because of signing, but my background does have some books around me. Next, to the second slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. So I was born deaf, of a family of hearing. There's myself and my younger sister who is also deaf. Growing up, having language access in education, and that has shaped the work I do today. While I was at the school for the deaf, first I had gone to a hearing public school. My parents thought by going to this public school, I would be receiving equitable education as my hearing peers. However, the theory and practice aren't necessarily the same thing. I experienced language deprivation. Within the classroom, I was present, but I wasn't included. I fell behind in my works, not because I couldn't learn. I'm very capable of learning, but the issue was having access to a language that I could utilize, which I did not have. Later on, I did transition to a deaf school that you see in the image in this slide, and it was a life-changing experience. I had full access to ASL, signed language, but also I had access to bilingual education through English spoken and written for part of the instruction. It was the first time I had a fully inclusive experience where I could learn, I could engage with my peers and have those relationships and have full communication. My identity and culture I was finally able to embrace them in this location. Ontario does have three government-run deaf schools, and it does show the possibilities when language and culture and access are taken as a priority. Next slide. This personal experience is why I am so passionate about accessibility and inclusion. Often I've attended events that are labeled inclusive or accessible, only to arrive to find out that there are no interpreters, no captions, no consideration for deaf participants. It's isolating and frustrating, but more importantly, it's also unnecessary. This can lead to feelings of frustrations and people being upset, and it's not necessary to happen. Access is more than just having interpreters and captions. It's a mindset.
Mm.
It's about ensuring that no one feels like an afterthought.
Mm. Access to someone.
When we include sign language, we are providing not only access to the presentation or performance, it's not just that, it's creating the environment where deaf participants can fully engage in every aspect of the event. It's not just sitting in the room and watching. It's also the mingling with the people and other attendees. It's joining in those conversations and participating in the after party or networking moments. These social interactions are just as important as the main event because this is often where those connections are made and experiences are enriched. Next slide, please. And during COVID, we saw that sign languages benefit everyone, not just the deaf community. We saw that communications through windows and wearing masks, how that highlighted the value of sign language. Politicians, after a bit, and brought in interpreters for public events during COVID news information because captions alone can't capture the tone, the nuances, and the emotion. Interpreters are needed to have that emphasis be visible. As well, seniors who lose their hearing, if they learn some sign language, that can be a benefit to easing the transition, replacing the fear and frustration that can be felt with confidence and preparation. Sign language is a bridge. It fosters connection. It breaks down barriers and ensures that no one is left out. Next slide, please. Canada is celebrated as a multicultural nation where diversity is embraced, but often it can feel like sign language and its culture are left out of the celebration. There was a time I was involved in a project that focused on linguistic diversity. There was French, Mandarin, Punjabi, various spoken language. So when I asked them about sign language, they were flabbergasted. Sign language is equivalent to a spoken language where we each have our own grammar, history, culture tied to that language. It's no different for a spoken language than a sign language in that respect. Being a language ally means that you stand up for that. It means hiring deaf professionals, learning some basic sign language, or by simply asking, how can I make this space more inclusive for you? Small actions like that can create big changes. Next slide, please. I'm deaf. I'm a mother. I'm an advocate. I'm an educator. Each of these identities shapes how I experience the world. But I've also learned that my story is just one of many. There are deaf immigrants who face language barriers on multiple levels. There are also racialized deaf individuals who have to navigate both ableism, racism, any of the isms. Deaf women who fight for space in both the deaf and hearing worlds, but are often excluded due to gender. Intersectionality is about seeing all of those layers. It's about understanding that it is not a one size fits all solution when you're talking about accessibility. In my work, I try to listen as much as I speak. I want to hear those other voices and then ask questions from a place of curiosity. I collaborate with people whose experiences are different than mine. Advocacy isn't just about raising your voice, it's about making space for others to be welcome and heard. Next slide, please. I want to share with you two very important initiatives that are close to my heart. There is S5 Waves and Sign Able Vision. S5 Waves is a organization that creates space where no one is excluded. At its events, no deaf child is isolated, and neither are the non-deaf children. Deaf children are now able to see adults, deaf adults, and then feel comfortable and confident in their identities and make those identities stronger. Parents are able to also learn how to support their deaf child and just have a betterment in their life. And then it's learning from our experiences to advocate to make things stronger and better. At the S5 Waves events, we always provide interpreters so it's accessible for all people. Sign-able vision focuses on training, helping individuals, organizations understand access, learn about signing, and provide inclusive space. Organizations can hire deaf individuals and then they're ready to support their deaf employee. So Signable Vision can provide events for those sorts of things where truly things are accessible. Both of these organizations, S5 Waves and Signable Vision, help to change mindsets, inspire and encourage real change. Next slide, please. So the stories I've shared with you today are my stories about the language itself, my experiences, It's about inclusion, the work of S5 Waves, and Sign-Able Vision. But this is just my story. It also helps to reflect the broader struggles and triumphs within the deaf community. We are all storytellers. We all have the power to shape the narrative. So I ask you to think about your role in this story. What kind of community do you want to build? For me, the answer is very simple. A community where no one is left out, where every hand, voice, and language matters. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And what sticks out to me is access is a mindset. It's not just, a set of principles and, things, add-ons. It's a mindset. And also the importance that sign language played during COVID. I know that. I work for a TV network, so that was very useful as well. And also the importance of listening as much as you're speaking and asking questions. So I have two questions for you. I'm just going to find them. The first one has to do with understanding deaf culture, right? How can recognizing and respecting sign language promote accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing communities?
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating the question? The interpreter
So
was
the
kind of left and right on my screen and I missed the question. If you wouldn't mind repeating it, thank
Okay,
you.
so the question is, how can recognizing and respecting sign language promote accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing communities?
By being inclusive. With the Accessible Canada Act, they have already put that recognition of sign language is in there. So it's providing interpreters, captioning, those sorts of things. But it should also be applicable to employment locations, organizations. Yes, there are some funding issues, but that's where you need to think about things beforehand, not as an afterthought. You need to prepare your budget so you have that accessibility fund ready to go.
Mhm. And do you find that the funding issue is often brought up as a reason to not provide the sign language services and other aids for the hard of hearing and deaf communities?
There's usually two, one of them being attitudes. If you're really passionate and you truly want things to be accessible, then you're going to make it happen. You're going to look for sponsors. You're going to fill out grant applications. You'll figure out a way to make it work. But if your attitude is, yeah, whatever, then it's never going to happen. And then it's last minute and it's like, oh, sorry, we couldn't provide it because it was last minute. So really, it comes down to an attitude where if you have the passion, you're going to figure out a way to make things work. The same as today. It's full access. There's ASL interpreters,
LSQ.
LSQ interpreters, thank you, and French spoken language as well. So if you want it to be fully accessible, it will be.
And that's the mindset again that you were talking about. My other question has to do with intersectionality and advocacy. You sort of hinted at that in your own experience. How does intersectionality play a role in language advocacy and promoting deaf culture?
When I think of my experiences growing up, my mom, my teacher, all the educators, it had that advocacy in it, but people weren't aware of the culture at that point. It was a very medicalized viewpoint where they made a lot of assumptions based on myths, where now as a deaf adult, it's like, no, 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 we've got all these things. There's so many deaf professionals out there if you look, but people make assumptions about the deaf and hard of hearing community. So we need to look at that intersectionality and start taking down those barriers to all the components.
Hmm. And just to add on to that question, since I work in the media, how can media help to sort of debunk all the myths and misconceptions, etc., in popular culture about the deaf community?
Just put it right out there. Sometimes using a picture-in-picture or a PIP, often the interpreters or the signers are very small. It should be reversed so that the signers are larger, uh, and not such a small box, but also bring in a deaf person to do the signing and then have the person who's speaking in a smaller box. But people often say, but you have the captions. Why don't you just rely on those? But those captions don't include the tone, the affect. They don't show the severity of what's happening. That whole emotional component is gone. And when the deaf community finally cried out and said, "Where is the interpreter?" and they brought those on screen, and we could see the facial grammar to indicate how serious the situation was for the pandemic, it became clearer for us. I mean, some of us are okay with the English, but at the same time, just seeing written English, there's no tone there for us, there's no emotion to indicate.
Wow, that's very very enlightening. So I'm going to go over to Amal, who has questions in the Q&A. Amal?
Thank you, Sarah. First, we have Catherine. She's just saying thank you, and this is an eye-opener. So thank you, Catherine. We have Samira Paris. She's saying that she's trying to find a way to connect with the qualified ASL interpreters. She's asking for recommendations.
Really, there's different services out there. Often it's best to start with a deaf organization. They'll have lists. You can also look to the Canadian, hopefully the interpreter will expand on that for me, Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters. They have a directory of interpreters, so you can look. Those are all individuals who are qualified interpreters who have gone through a process to be approved to join your organization, or ask the deaf person, which is often the best person. If you have a deaf employee, ask if there's a preferred interpreter they have, because then that way you ensure that the interpreter being hired understands the communication approaches being used. Not every interpreter is a match for every individual or every setting, so miscommunications can happen that way. So it is always best, if you can, to ask the deaf person who's asked for an interpreter directly who they prefer to work with.
Thank you. One last question. I think it's a shorter one. Do we have deaf community literature to express themselves?
Oh, we have stories, we have Divya art, we have poetry, ASL slam poetry, ABC and A to Z stories. The list is long. Again, if you ask the deaf community or organization for that information, we do have a vast, rich history up until present time.
Sorry, one more question. Have you explored how AI, artificial intelligence, and sign languages interpretation can work together?
Now, I mean, I understand the implications, but it's not feasible right now. If AI is provided, again, it's missing that personal experience. Like, I think for a medical situation, I'd rather a real person sitting in front of me, because if it's a room full of doctors, questions, but it can be complicated through AI, but maybe the individual also utilizes what's called a deaf interpreter to facilitate communication. So there are certain aspects that AI would not work. Here, especially, I wouldn't want AI, but like for example, if maybe you're looking at a web page and you need the text form converted into ASL, maybe that would work. I don't think it's there yet. Maybe the community has different opinions, but that one's mine. It's challenging now. It's really getting out there. I think it could be very easy for misinformation to get out, the tone be missed or misapplied. So it's still a work in progress.
Thank you. That's all from my side.
Yeah, just to close out the Q&A, one last question. You talked about best practices. You talked about the S5 and that other initiative. Have you ever experienced a situation that just showed what not to do? Okay, where there were barriers to accessibility for deaf persons, and so how did these barriers to accessibility impact the situation or the event? Do you have any examples that you've actually experienced?
I went to an event where I was invited, and I did tell them beforehand. I said, I'm deaf. I need access. And they're, oh yeah, of course, not a problem, not a problem. I showed up. There was no interpreter. But really, so many people assume the interpreter is there for me, but they're not. The interpreter is there for the non-signing people. So fortunately, I was able to text to an interpreter that I know. I'm like, can you come here? But fortunately in that I was able, but I'm not always. In Kingston, Ontario, my home, really there are 2 interpreters. That means availability can be very tight. And across Canada, there's just not enough interpreters. And they're thin. They're spread very thin because they work 24/7. So sometimes I will reach out, but I would like to have a policy set up to make things better, to have things run more smoothly.
So it was very disruptive, and for you anyway, the experience.
Yeah, it was.
I'm curious. Well,
And it would be for anyone.
yes. Yes, indeed. And since we have a little bit more time, I'm always curious about linguistic diversity generally, but within the deaf culture. Can you tell us more about how we can create inclusive environments that support this linguistic diversity of the deaf community, of deaf individuals?
And Canada, there's many immigrants that are deaf that have come in. So not only are they facing their home language, they're now maybe on their 4th or 5th language that they're learning. And I really applaud them. You're coming into a new country and you've got to focus on all of that. But also, it's ensuring things are set up beforehand and looking at it from their perspective as well. Not, I'll just give you paper and pen, this is good enough. Truly include people in the process. Hire deaf consultants, advocates for providing that support.
Hmm. Are there any other questions in the Q&A?
No, we have Lata. She's saying, thank you, Leah. We love the presentation and excellent ASL.
Thank you.
I would have been curious about when you're in a linguistic minority setting, like you're French, a French-speaking uh, person in a mainly Anglophone setting, having to find ways to communicate as a deaf individual. Do you find that that is respected?
I think it's really the same all around. If it's hearing with French and English and trying to work, I think it's very much paralleled within the deaf community.
Hmm.
There's barriers, but for hearing individuals, they can pick up other sounds, what other individuals are talking about if somebody is there. I need it visually in sign language as the other deaf community members. So there is that benefit for the spoken language communities where it is a bit of a barrier for us. So it's recognizing those social components. Now, deaf people can understand those frustrations that spoken individuals experience because that's our daily life.
Mm-hmm.
People think it's nothing, that it's just something small, but it's not. It's a huge component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that.
I think the problem is that people don't realize, sorry to interrupt you there.
No, no, no.
People don't realize that sign languages have cultures, that sign language is a language. There's still often a view that it's a disability issue, but it's not. It's all of our lived experience. The same with any other spoken language, be it French or Spanish. We have those histories, but it's not recognized by the mainstream society about sign language. And we've had sign languages forever, but it was in the 1880s with the Milan Conference where sign languages were banned. And it was then you could only teach by using voice and sound. So it was a huge shift. And it was very detrimental to our communities because again it was medicalized views. You need hearing aids, you need cochlear implants, which are great. They have their benefits to fill in those gaps. But to be able to fully express yourself and not have those gaps, those things missing, it's really vital to have access to sign language as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that sort of little bit of historical background about the evolution. And speaking of evolution, you sort of hinted at technology earlier. How can technology be leveraged to enhance accessibility for the deaf community?
Again, having sign language included in things. There's a company in the States, you know how you can use your online chat. They now have it so you can utilize sign language. People can look at it and see the sign. So there'll be English and then there'll be an ASL button that you can push instead. And then they have staff ready to go. From my view, it's not just about sign language only for having those. It's having the language, it's having captioning, it's having a transcript available so that nobody is left out regardless of what their needs are.
Thank you so much, Leah, for your presentation and your very thoughtful responses to our questions. I think I'm going to have to get hold of you offline so that we can look at what they're doing at our TV
Oh, bring
network.
it on. Please, please do.
Yes, because you've got little light bulbs going off in my mind. Thank you so, so much. So before we get into our next story, we're excited to introduce the Action Button tool, a powerful feature that allows you to engage supporters and drive impactful actions. By using the Action Button, you can easily contact your representative at the federal and provincial territorial levels to advocate for language access policies. The tool is user-friendly and ensures that your message reaches the right people with just a few clicks. We encourage you to share this tool within your network to amplify our collective voice and make a significant impact. So we're going to move on to our next storyteller. Nuzat Abbas is a writer, critic, and advocate of translated work. Nuzat is the founding editor of Trace Press and is committed to promoting transnational, anti-imperialist, and decolonial feminist perspectives. With years of experience in the arts, education, and social justice, she has taught courses on literature, gender, conflict, and migration. She's also curated cultural events. Please welcome Nuzat Abbas. I hope I pronounced your name right.
Hello, everyone. Can you all see me and hear me correctly right now? Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And it's been really wonderful to listen to Leah's presentation. I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. And I first want to thank everyone who's organized Language Advocacy Day. I started watching what it was doing 2 or 3 years ago, and it's been fantastic to see how it's grown. I feel we're all connected in this desire to have a more plurilingual Canada, one that acknowledges most of all the Indigenous roots that we are part of and grateful to be on this land. And also the many, many languages and stories and literatures and thousands of year-old traditions that we all bring with us as immigrants and migrants and refugees into this place. So that's very much where I come from. I want to thank the interpreters who are doing a tremendous job, and all the organizing as well that happened behind the scenes. So I'll start with the slides, and thank you, Selena, for running them for me. I started Trace. It actually evolved from a previous project I was doing. We're a nonprofit that used to focus on community arts and migrant storytelling and memoir writing with refugees and immigrants. And I did that for a long time, on and off as I was teaching. And then around 2019, I kind of moved it towards a literary publishing press. That's because of my own love of literature. And we started focusing on specifically on translated literature from the Global South. And we also do literary nonfiction in English. And I'll speak more about that and show you some examples. We've only done 3 books so far. I'll focus on 2 of them towards the end of this talk. And I can talk a little bit about the new ones that we have planned as we move forward. So some of you may learn a lot about publishing that you didn't know about small press publishing, which is very different from what you see in the bookstores most of the time. So I hope you'll leave with some more knowledge and some more transparency on how books get made, that they're not just commodities, they're actually processes, and they take a lot of time, at least 2 years to make a book. Next slide, please. The next slide, yeah. This slide kind of represents, it's something we publish in all our books on the last page. And it represents what Trace stands for as a metaphor and as the project, the publishing project that we do. Trace is both a verb and a noun. It's act and residue. Trace collaborates with writers and translators to publish books that illuminate in complex, beautiful, and thought-provoking ways contemporary and historical experiences of conflict, war, displacement, exile, migration, the environment, labor, and resistance. I say this, but we're also very interested in pleasure, in simply the pleasure of beauty. And sometimes when I select books, I'll go towards those as much as I go towards the sort of political stuff. So please don't think we just do this very heavy, rigid kind of literature. We actually really go for very innovative writing, writing that kind of pushes against boundaries. We look for words that draw connections between here and there, now and then, voices that ask us to question, reflect, take pleasure, love, remember, and build solidarity across our many differences. We're unafraid to mix genres, voices, and languages, and our writers do that very interestingly in the projects that they present to us, and we're a nonprofit. Next slide, please. This tells you something about what we're doing. We do translations of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction from the Global South. We do hybrid literary nonfiction. So the kind of nonfiction we do, and I'll be very honest, it's very much at this point, me, a very small board. We have various editors and translators that we work with, and freelance marketing staff. So it's a very small enterprise. And so basically I get to make a lot of the decisions. And so it goes with my taste as an editor and publisher, which is kind of how small presses tend to work. And my own taste in literature and literary nonfiction is quite experimental. I like things that really make you think about how language works, that kind of track the kind of relationship between history and memory, personal and political, and that's very sort of interesting, innovative, beautiful writing. I really go for that. And we also do anthologies, which often are multi-genre, multidisciplinary. Some of them are a bit more academic, but we try and do it for a general audience. And that juxtapose vital voices in conversation. Next slide. All of us at Trace, including myself at this moment, are immigrants and refugees. So our board, our staff, our writers, our translators and volunteers, for the most part, have roots in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. One of our board members is from Peru. And also grew up in Europe. So, it's very mixed. We're feminist, we're internationalist, we're queer, at least I am, and several people connected to us are. We're transpositive, and we're committed to a progressive, anti-imperialist, and decolonial practices in what we do. And this is very much how we try and do our work within Canada and the world. We're not interested, and I say this with some delicacy because, of course, I support diverse practices, but we're not interested in diversifying Canadian publishing, and I'll speak more about that as we go. We're more interested in building currents of affinity and solidarity with progressive writers, artists, and movements from and within what is termed the Global South and its diasporas, in relation to the decolonial and anti-racist efforts of Indigenous and Black communities in the Americas who created the ground on which someone like myself can come as an immigrant to do this work. So I'm very, very grateful for all the incredible work, the literary work, the organizing work, and the thinking work that allows us to come in as immigrants and refugees to bring in also conversations around the literatures and the Indigenous struggles in the different parts of the world we come from. Next slide, please. And so you understand what kind of context I currently work in. It's a bit shocking. First of all, I think many of you may not know, most of the books in the world are done by, or at least in the English-speaking world, are published by what we call the big five publishers, which is Random House Penguin, which is now one big publisher, which is actually run by a German company called Bertelsmann. It's a huge conglomerate. And its founder has some rather problematic political origins. The other one is Hachette, which is French, which was recently bought by a major French right-wing billionaire. So it's really important to know that what we see as just very nice and lovely literature often is rooted in economies that are really complicated and difficult to absorb because they dominate. The big five, they are the ones you see the big prizes, the Booker Prize, the Giller Prize, all of those prizes. Most of the books given to those prizes come from the big presses because they have a lot of money. Canadian publishing, and I'd like to go back to the previous slide, Selena, if you can go back to Canadian publishing sector. And this includes both the bigger presses and the smaller presses. And we receive support. At this point, Trace doesn't. We're about to start applying for Canadian publishing grants. But the sector itself, from a 2018 report from the Association of Canadian Publishers, these numbers have changed slightly now. It's 82% white, 74% female, 72% heterosexual. The more recent study kind of has shown better numbers around more people identifying as gender non-binary. A few more people got hired because of the Black movement struggles of 2020 onwards, or 2016 onwards, actually. And so there were a few more hirings that took place. There was also a little more funding. And so sometimes I wonder if the diversification that we see in small presses in Canada really is about suddenly money got given. And that's why they started doing more Indigenous, more Black, more, people of color publishing, both as staff members, but also for books that they chose to publish. I wonder, there are a lot of questions. There've also been scandals around racism and sexism in the sector. And a lot of conversation. There's a lot of commitment I see in the small press sector to transform the sector. And there are a few presses that are run by people of color. There used to be a very important press, and I want to pay homage to it, run by a Jamaican lesbian woman in the 80s and 90s. It was called Sister Vision Press. It was run by Makeda Silvera. It was groundbreaking. They published a number of really important anthologies. And the kind of work I do, even though it's very different, we're doing very, very different work. I always remain grateful for the model that Makeda set forward for feminist publishing. There used to be a lot of other white-run feminist presses. Many of them closed down. We used to have a bookstore in Toronto called the Toronto Women's Bookstore, which was extraordinary. That too got shut down. So we've seen a lot of losses in the time that I have come in Canada. I've also lived in the US, but these have been important markers, and it's been disturbing to see. And that came up because of the rise of chapters in Indigo and the kind of pressures that are put on small independent bookstores and publishers. So I will ask all of you who are listening, please, please buy your books from independent bookstores. Support them. They're important. They tend to support independent presses a lot as well. So the independent sector is a very interesting, creative. They take risks with writers. They allow, and often what happens is they kind of make things possible, and then the writers get famous, and then the big five presses sort of swoop in and pick them up. And so we have to start again from scratch always, and we have less money. So if you want to support interesting, innovative publishing, please support the independent sector. Next slide, please. Our values at Trace keep evolving, but primarily we believe in the power of small, brave human voices in concert with the voices of others. Our books and our processes are small scale, sustainable, affordable. We try and keep our books. I give discounts for particular kinds of groups that want to read our books. I try and make it affordable if I'm making ebooks for students who want to have access to the books. It's difficult when we ourselves don't have money, but it's very important as a value for us as well. Our books we try and make them beautiful to hold and to touch. We want them to carry power within. They also take other forms, including audio and digital. We've done digital books. We haven't done audio yet, but we're looking forward to trying that out. And our books cross and contest borders of language and genre. One of the things about being a publisher in Canada is there's a lot of emphasis on sort of Can-Lit and Canadian nationalism in publishing, including in the funding. Our books, we realize, have fans, like absolute people who love the books across the world, and they want to have access to the books. So one of our challenges is distributing our books and making sure that they're available across the world, because we find that they're very, very popular. And right now, for example, one of our books is going to be taught at the University of Nantes in France. It's been taught in the University of London. It's going to be taught at Princeton this year. So, you know, and we have people who are trying to order them from Dubai, from New Zealand, from all over the world. So it's a challenge for us, that whole economy of shipping and distribution as well. Next slide. Now I'm going to be introducing you. I'm just going to take a drink of water. This is a book we put out in 2023, and it's one of the few books that I've edited fully. And it came out of a series of conversations that we also held with translators and writers and poets. We invited them. I was thinking about this whole question, and I wanted to know what translators, and by translators, I mean literary translators. They're the ones I reached out to, and poets and writers. And I wanted to find out what they thought about the questions of language and colonialism. And the result was extraordinary. It taught me a lot. And the book has itself become very, very popular with literary translators around the world. And all the people who participated in the project are all Black, Indigenous, and people of color from around the world and in Canada. So what are the histories, constraints, and possibilities of language in relation to bodies, origins, land, colonialism, gender, war, displacement, desire, and migration? Moving across genres, memories, belongings, and borders, these luminous texts, they're very experimental texts, by the way. They're memoir, they have history, they have theory, they have criticism, they're very mixed in the way they present themselves. They invite us to consider translation as a form of ethical and political love, one that requires attentive regard of an other and a making and unmaking of self. The foreword, I was really, really pleased to receive it, a beautiful foreword from the French decolonial feminist theorist Françoise Vergès, who is an extraordinary academic and activist and writer. And I didn't know her. I just reached out to her and asked if she would want to write us a foreword. And she wrote a really beautiful, very personal exploration of what moving from Réunion, where she comes from, but she's of various Vietnamese French background and living in France now, and what it meant for her, for example, to work with English, but English also allowed her to find writers from all over the world and the Black tradition in English. So it's a beautiful foreword. The essays are beautiful in this book. We have writers from Indonesia, from India, from Palestine, from Uganda, from Sri Lanka. We have from Kashmir and Saudi Arabia and Rwanda. So it's very, very diverse. Next slide. I'm going to leave you, actually, I'm going to say something. Yeah, there's a question in Gopika Jadeja, who's an Indian literary translator and poet and writer. And in this book, In River in an Ocean, she ends her essay with a list of questions. And the first question is, what is decolonial translation? What is translation? What is decolonial? What is decolonial about translation? Does translation have to be decolonial? Can we decolonize the practice of translation? What is the role of English in decolonial translation? And so on it goes, but they're really provocative questions. And so carrying those questions forward, we then ran 2 series of workshops in 2022 and 2023 called Trace Translating X. And one of them was looking at, and I chose 2 languages. One was Arabic and the other was Tamil. And the reason for that is these are both classical languages. They're very, very old languages with very old histories of literature, right? So when you think of English, that kind of, 11th century Chaucer, and then you have sort of growing, it becomes more 16th century Shakespeare, and then you have 19th century languages that I'm familiar with, like a Swahili and Urdu, really also started 11th century and grew their literary canons in the 19th century. So when you end up with Arabic and Tamil, these are ancient. And it was stunning for me. I learned a lot in witnessing what happened in the workshops. And through the workshops, which went on for over 2022 and 2023, we did readings afterwards. And then we made books out of it. So it's been a long, very, very loving community-based process. And so I'm very proud and very happy. We put out the first one called Arabic Between Love and War. It was edited by Nora Al-Kharashi and Yasmin Haj, who also ran the workshops with us. And it's a book of bilingual poetry. The poets are from all over, from Lebanon, Syria. We have a lot of poets from Iraq, from Palestine, from diasporas as well. And the Syria as well. And then the translators are also from various places, including Libya. We also have a poet who translated his own poetry from Tunisia and from Sudan. And I'm very actually excited about the Sudan project because we're actually turning that into one of our next books. So it's a beautiful book of poetry. And we decided to center on love and war. And if you look at the cover, I'm very pleased that my designer made this beautiful thing with the 2 words, because the word hub, for those of you who know Arabic, is of course love. Those of you know who Urdu and Hindi, the word is mohabbat. The root is hub. And the word, when you just put the little letter ra in between, it becomes harb, which is war. And I think this is something that Arabic has a tradition of thinking this through, and poetically as well. And so in this book, the translators gather to perform an intimate labor. They move the words from English into Arabic, or reversing such direction as language dissolves into cities, landscapes, or portals that open to rubble or only air. These poems reverberated the space between there and here, silence and voice, original and translation, and the polarities of war and love. We started this project, of course, in 2022, but it came to an end or was being made into a book after Gaza started getting bombed. So it was very, very difficult, very painful. We added some more poems to the book. And we also have poems written in English that were translated into Arabic. And I think that's a very interesting thing that we're doing in our project. So we kind of go both ways sometimes, especially when we do a bilingual book. And partly we want to make the book travel and be accessible to all kinds of readers. And I'd be very interested, Effie, in the Q&A to hear from audiences how they think bilingual books work for them in this space in Canada. So this kind of brings, this is our latest book. The next one we're working on that I hope to bring out in spring, if I'm not too exhausted, is going to be on Tamil. It's called, I think we're calling it Tamil Terrains, but we're still talking about the title. And it's going to be edited by Nidra Rodrigo and Geeta Sukumaran, who are fantastic Toronto-based Tamil translators, literary translators. They're scholars, they're academics. And they've been very good friends to Trace from the start. So I'm very excited. And that collection is really experimental because we've worked with a lot of young people who hadn't translated before. So it's going to be a very sort of a different project than this Arabic one. So this is kind of our books. I should stop here. And we can go to the next slide. So if you want to support us, and please do, because I think you are part of our community. So please join us. We're very community centered. Go to our website at tracepress.org. We're starting a newsletter. I keep on saying this, and I never get around to it, but I will this year start a newsletter. It's time because social media is getting insane. We are on social media. We're on X, which we're not, we may be leaving it, but it's at Trace Press. We're on Instagram at Trace Press 00, and we're on Blue Sky now at Trace Press. And we're also on LinkedIn. There's a Trace thing you can follow. So please, buy our books. You can buy from the website or any bookstore in Canada, and please support independent publishing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very eye-opening, and I was shocked at the statistics about publishing and whose work gets published. And also, I'd like to thank you for mentioning Makeda Silveira. It is Black History Month right now, so mentioning the likes of Sister Vision Press, that means a lot. And also the impact that the sort of concentration of owners of publishing houses gobbling up independent bookstores, the impact that has on the kind of work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been asked before to translate people's books and literary works, etc. Immediately I've said no. I'm not qualified to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us how you vet, translators of literary works that you want to publish, or people who have translated works? How do you vet that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. I think literary translation requires like a tremendous sensitivity to language, the kind of sensitivity of a poet or a writer. So, or people who've studied literature a lot. So it's a very difficult thing. And I'm very impressed with translators. I admire them. I've done some translations myself, but I do not trust myself, partly because my language skills are not as good. And now I've been away from, the countries I grew up in for many, many years. So don't even ask me to speak in Kiswahili. I understand, but I will not speak. I'm too embarrassed. Or my Urdu or my Gujarati, and the sort of smattering of Spanish and whatnot that I have. So I am not a translator, but I have a good ear for language. and a very good ear for English, actually, and the literature of English, but also of other languages. Like I grew up listening in a very sonic culture to Kiswahili, to Urdu, to Gujarati, like a lot of different languages that are sort of Indian Ocean languages. And I think that taught me a certain sensitivity. And I think translators come with a profound sensitivity to actual words. I've seen translators agonize over one word to understand how it works, for example, say in Arabic. And if you bring it to English, it loses that. So what other word can you bring in that would work within an English poetic structure without, there's this whole debate between foreignizing and, localizing. And I studied with the Urdu, very well-known Urdu translator, Professor Mayman, who would kind of translate Urdu short stories into English, but he'd make them sound like Americans speaking. And I would kind of go, no, 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 Professor, I don't think you should be doing this. And he would disagree with me because his audience in mind was sort of this white American audience that he wanted to bring his Urdu stories to get read by them. My audience is diaspora audiences of color who may have some sense of the languages. And I invite my translators to work towards bringing their books across to transnational diasporic audiences of color so that we can listen to each other, right? Because one of the things that always distresses me is how little we know of each other, right? And how can we learn more? And we can learn more if we read each other's literatures, because literature is where a language reaches its most beautiful expression, its most sophisticated thought. And yeah, so I think that's something I'm very committed to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm always worried about that. And I'm just honest and I just say, I don't have that sensibility. So I'm not even going to do this work the injustice of trying to translate it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
I would encourage people to actually study and read a lot.
yes,
Read a
exactly.
lot.
It's a whole
Study.
different discipline.
It is.
Yes. Yeah. And as a Swahili speaker myself, I'm from Kenya. I do sort of also appreciate, how, the different sensibilities you have to have. And you sort of hinted at this, but how the works that you publish, how does that contribute to the understanding of the global South and diasporic experiences?
How did it? This is going to be for the readers to tell me. I'm very curious. We're still new, right?
Okay.
But for example, right now with the Arabic book, okay, I have a young person who works for me at the press some, hours a week, who's a young Somali Yemeni poet in Toronto, grew up in Toronto, wonderful young person, a poet herself. And so she encounters a book like this, and she's intrigued on a poetic level. How does this make her think about poetry, right? She can't read the Arabic. But I'm trying to say, yes, please read Toni Morrison, please read Dion Brand, please read the amazing, amazing writers we have. But also read Najla Al-Thoum, who's a Sudanese poet who writes in Arabic, right? If you're interested in indigenous literatures, read Miled Faiza, who's an Amazigh poet from Tunisia. There are many indigenous traditions in the world. So I think all of this is part of the conversation we're inviting people to have, and that we can encounter them. And sometimes the conversations we're having in the West about literature and even about immigration and immigrant literatures, they're not the conversations people are having in their own languages. They're having the Global South has its own problems and its own stories to tell. And sometimes I think that's my immigrant self going, oh, just get out of yourself. Canada is not the world. North America is not the world. The world is big, it's vast. It speaks differently. Listen, just listen, So that's kind of my philosophy, I think, of how I approach literature.
Yeah. And so what role does translation of works like what you publish, what role does the translation play in decolonial feminist work?
I wish I
And
knew
what
the
does that
answer.
mean? What does that mean? Decolonial feminist work.
Yeah. I see it as an ongoing process. And I start with Ngugi, you're Kenyan, of course, you know
That's right.
Ngugi,
Ngugi wa Thiong'o
Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Mwalimu.
writes in Kikuyu.
He writes in Kikuyu, and he chose. And for those of you who don't know, we always feel that Ngugi wa Thiong'o should have gotten a Nobel Prize, but I'm very
Yes.
glad that my countryman, Abdurrazak Gurnau, did get it for writing in English. But Ngugi, for me, has been very important because he, at a certain point, chose to write his novels in Kikuyu and translate them himself into English. Right? So the incredible labor. The last time I met Ngugi, he was actually learning Kiswahili because he wanted to read. I mean, he was he is such a great, constantly learning person, right? But his idea of decolonization was, well, what happened particularly to Africa, and I think in Africa more than anywhere else, because so many of the languages were oral, except languages like Kiswahili. They don't have strong literary traditions, but they have strong song and oral traditions. They're spoken all the time. And then when colonization happened, whether it was the Portuguese or the English or the French or the Germans, like in Tanzania, that the languages, like people started writing the Bible coming in and the translations of the Bible, which by the way is the translation of the Bible is, when you're studying translation, is crucial to look at because the dictionaries got made during that time by Christian missionaries. So we have to almost interrogate the dictionaries too as we read. And so I feel like one of the things like in River in an Ocean, which I hope you will read, because this is very much sort of our thinking through decolonial feminist translation. The pieces by Otunia Okot Pitek, who is Okot Pitek's daughter, the great Ugandan translator. And there's an essay by Lisa Ndujuru, who's from Rwanda. There's an essay by Irene Tushabe, who is also from Uganda. And by the way, Irene and Otonia both have novels out this year. So please buy their novels. They are from the big presses, but they're great novels. Actually, no, Irene's is from Anansi. They're wonderful, wonderful writers. And they examine, like they grapple with that question for Africa. What does it mean? I think India, the Arab world, they work with language and translation differently. The feminist part is to think through how gender inflects language. Sometimes it's just translating more women writers. Sometimes it's thinking through sexism in language. And the next collection we're doing, the Tamil one, is really amazing because we have classical poems that young contemporary feminist and queer translators have rewritten and revised, and they're kind of almost creating their own works out of these, some of the very sort of, my darling went off to sea and I'm going to die now. And they're like, oh, no, 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 lady, don't die. Like, you can live on. And so they're kind of working with these very sort of classical tropes and traditions that we come from around gender in poetry.
That
I hope,
is that really is amazing. And somebody was asking if the books that you publish are available as ebooks.
yes, we have the River in an Ocean is an ebook. It's on our website. I just received yesterday the ebook for the Arabic. I'm checking it today. I'll see if it's ready to go, then I'll put it up. Yes. But poetry, we do encourage you to buy the print copy because it's much nicer to read a poetry book in print. But yeah, River in an Ocean is available as an ebook.
I agree. I don't do ebooks at all.
Good for you.
Amal has a question from the Q&A. Amal?
Thank you, Nuzhat, for the interesting and insightful presentation. We do have some thank yous and people appreciating the presentation. And we do have two questions in here. I find them interesting. The first one says, what is your submission and selection process for poets and writers among us?
It's right now because we only have, we have very limited capacity. As I said, I only became eligible for applying for, say, for a Canada Council grant as a publisher Canada Council, or like they tend to support only Canadian writers, right? So we tend to publish international writers as well. So we have a challenge with our funding. So I can only do 2 or 3 books a year right now. So it's very limited. We're already booked for 2026. We're doing 3 books of poetry in 2026. So now we're thinking 2027. I noticed another question, how long does it take? It takes at least 1 or 2 years for sure to make a book. So our selection process right now, I'm having to turn away a lot, but I am interested. I am always looking. And so if people are willing to be patient and sit with me, while we're still building trees, we're still very new. And I'm hoping we will get more funding this year, which means I can hire more editors, people to work with me. So I'm not doing all the work. And that would mean that we can take on more books and have the capacity, because books are very expensive to produce as well. Paper prices have gone up, labor prices, of course, everyone deserves to live. Right now, I don't get to pay myself yet properly, so that's very hard. I'm not a rich person. A lot of people in editing and publishing, by the way, are very rich, it turns out. I didn't know that either. They're not just white and male, they're rich. I'm not rich at all. So it's been a challenge. What we're doing is really against the grain. So when I select books, like right now I'm looking at some nonfiction, I'm looking at stuff that shows that the writer has really thought. They're very well read, they've thought about literature, they have some publication experience. If they're translators, they should have translations published in small magazines. So they're coming in with a strong resume. And then I look at the work itself, like how sophisticated, I'm looking for certain sophistication in thought, in beauty, in poetry, and something innovative. So I'll talk about a book that we're planning on doing, which is of a Pakistani writer, Sara Shagufta. When I started the press, I actually had her in mind. And now, lo and behold, a young translator suddenly approaches me and says, hey, I've been working on this. Do you want it? And what I found really interesting, because I was thinking I might do it with a friend, we'll sit and we'll translate the poems or whatever, is that Sara Shagufta died when she was in her late 20s. It may have been a suicide. This young poet is almost the same age. She's a poet. She's Pakistani. She's fluent in English and Urdu. She really is very, very, like, she's read through the work. She knows it well. And she's doing these very innovative translations because she's also trained in the US and kind of has read a lot of Black poetry as well and various other traditions. And she's kind of bringing that into her translation in very sophisticated ways. So it intrigued me. It was something interesting that she's doing in a very thoughtful way with the poems. So yeah, things like that. So that's one thing. Yeah.
Sorry, I think this relates to another question where they're asking, how do you ensure that the storyteller's voice stays authentic? It's not hijacked by the translator.
Great question.
Yeah.
Yes, it's something, I'm kind of one of the authenticity people too. So, but I'm also very open when translators make a good argument as to why. So I think we want a translation is not transparent. It is another text written by the translator. So even right now, whatever I'm saying, whoever's translating it into French or sign language, they're making their own text out of it. I would hope they're true to what I'm saying, but translation in itself destabilizes the language. So it's something I have a conversation about with every translator. And I'm very receptive when the translator comes to me. But I do encourage, I don't want, because the Global South does get overwritten by the West. I want the peculiarities of the language to remain sometimes, and I want the difference to be visible. I don't want everything to become completely absorbed into English.
Yep, fair enough. One last question from my side, and then I'll leave the others for you to read and answer to them personally.
Thank you.
This question says, is there any interest or opportunities to collaborate with artists from other fields, like for instance, the visual or media fields in particular, to work on joint projects?
You know, I'm open. because I said I'm hybrid, right? I think I'll be curious. I'm always open to conversations. So drop me an email, let's chat. Um, I think it's about money, of course. Everything's about money. But yeah, let's talk. I'm very curious. Yeah.
Thank you, Nuzha.
Okay, I lied. I have another question. One comment really struck me that Trace Press is not here to quote unquote diversify the Canadian publishing industry. And you're right, with the whole George Floyd thing, a lot of money was thrown into anything Black that was being done, arts, culture, literature, etc., etc. So when you, what do you mean by that? That you're not there to diversify,
Yeah.
even as you celebrate diversity
Mhm.
in literary expression.
Yeah. I came to Canada in the 80s. For those of you who came to Canada in the 80s, you remember how bad it was. It was not friendly. It was not a welcoming place. It was hard to find an apartment. It was hard to find a job. So if you're a literary person like myself, it was impossible. I used to work in bookstores. My background is very much, I did work in bookstores. That's how I went to school. I paid my way through school. Um, and I've seen, and I'm glad, very, very happy to see how the city of Toronto has changed, how it's transformed, how it's, and I want to see different faces everywhere, of course. However, not every face that looks like you or me has our interests at heart. I think some people, I think diversity, and we can see that right now, right? That not, yeah, there are people. And I think, come on, I grew up in the third world. I grew up under dictatorships. We're not all beautiful people either, so I have no romance around diversity. What I want is a commitment towards a transformation that doesn't need diversity initiatives, right? I want a transformation that is truly about saying, hey, when you talk about literature, let's talk about literature. Let's not assume that the only literature, the greatest novel ever written. I mean, I love Shakespeare, but come on, Shakespeare was just one out of many, many great. Have you read Hafiz? Have you read Ghalib? Have you? So it's like we don't know each other. We don't know the world. And I feel my sort of decolonial feminist, the same thing with feminism. It's like if you're only reading men, and when I went to university, I had to read nothing but men. When I had to teach the curriculum I had to teach at a particular college, the only queer voice was like a tiny bit by Walt Whitman. And I was a queer immigrant, and I had to teach basically white male literature. So these kinds of things, of course, annoy me. They're part of the histories that I bring to Trace as an editor. As you can see, I get kind of pissed off sometimes. But here we are, and now we're making books. And what kind of books are we going to make that somehow shift? Sometimes when I'm getting writings from the global south, unfortunately, it's very hard to find writings by women. So one of the literatures I'm very committed to publishing is Tamil literature from Sri Lanka, particularly, not from India necessarily, but from Sri Lanka. Very difficult because some of the great women poets did not survive the war, or because of the war and the displacement, they weren't able to do the books. Right? So it's economics of living. So if we transform economics of living, we will have more writers. Right?
That is a fabulous note on which to end. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and definitely, you've just gotten yourself a new customer for your books. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Wow. So, before we introduce our final storyteller, I'd like to highlight the work of the Linguistic Justice Foundation, LJF, a dedicated nonprofit organization striving for linguistic justice for all. LJF envisions a world where language rights are universally respected, emphasizing that social justice is intrinsically linked to linguistic justice. One of their key initiatives is the Language Rights Pledge, which encourages individuals and organizations to commit to combating systemic linguistic discrimination and promoting the value and protection of all languages and their speakers. This pledge highlights the importance of education, research, and capacity building in fostering linguistic equity. We will share more details about this initiative in the chat box, including a link to sign the pledge and make donations. Now, please join me in welcoming our final presenter for today, Gail Prasad, PhD. She's an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. Gail's research examines social representations of linguistic diversity and promotes critical, creative, and collaborative approaches to multilingual language awareness. She's the co-editor of Multilingualism in Education, Researchers, Pathways, and Perspectives, and she's published extensively in both English and French. Please welcome Gail Prasad. Gail?
Thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here today with you. It's a real privilege, and I've so enjoyed hearing the stories that have come before me. I I'm going to share some stories, which is not necessarily the traditional mode for academics today, but I am an arts-based researcher. So I'm sharing very personal stories today to give you a sense of how language is woven into my life as the daughter of immigrants, a language teacher, an arts-based educator, and a multilingual teacher educator. So imagine a world where every thread of language weaves together to create a vibrant tapestry of communication. Today, I want to take you on a journey through my own tapestry, woven with the threads of multiple languages and cultures. Weaving has always fascinated me, both as a practice and as a metaphor. The warp on the loom provides the structure, much like language policies that shape and constrain our language practices. And the weft threads of our stories and lives become woven into the fabric of society as we move through different spaces with different policies dictating what we can and cannot do and say. One of the things I find the most captivating in life is how people weave their own communicative repertoires. A communicative repertoire is like a web of all the languages and varieties that we use to communicate with everyone in our life. It might include different languages you learned from your parents and grandparents, as well as the different ways we speak to our children, our neighbors, colleagues, and even our pets. For us as individuals, everything counts. But language norms provide the warping structure of every um, institution across society and privilege certain languages and their speakers. So, using the metaphor of the loom, language practices are not a problem of the speaker, but a problem for the speaker when the warped norms and policies enacted within different institutions and systems don't recognize, accept, or respect them. As a multilingual advocate and ally, I always say that awareness matters. Being aware of the invisible norms and the explicit policies and how they impact individuals differently is the beginning of understanding difference and weaving strong and more inclusive communities. At the forefront of my practice is the belief that people are never the problem. Rather, access to and support within institutions is. And so, in my work as a researcher, I've been conducting classroom based research with teachers to design multilingual pedagogies that serve all students in developing greater awareness of the value of linguistic diversity. Schools and classrooms are the ideal context in which to build critical multilingual language awareness and multilingual allyship because we teach and learn through language. And classrooms today include students who use a wide range of languages across their lives, and they can be supported to use and share them with all students and teachers. While schools in Canada have traditionally been institutions warped by monolingualism, teaching in English or French as the dominant language of instruction, the richness and diversity of languages that students bring with them into schools today make it possible um, to engage in endless possibility if we shift towards multilingualism as the norm. This vision of linguistic flourishing, or in order for this vision of linguistic flourishing to be realized, multilingual awareness matters. And we must also agree that growth is possible and, in fact, required for everyone. Like Lee said earlier, it's not just the multilingual student who needs to be supported, but the official monolingual Anglophone or the official monolingual Francophone, as well as the multilingual student, need to be supported to weave a communicative repertoire together. Every individual's communicative repertoire is a dynamic tapestry of languages that is always changing and can always expand. And my hope for Canadian classrooms is that they become sites of linguistic flourishing instead of sites of loss, shame, and insecurity. Research has shown us that children who come to school speaking other home languages often lose proficiency in those languages and don't develop strong literacy in them if they're not affirmed at school. The result is that we graduate high school students who are monolingual rather than bi or multilingual Canadians. So, this afternoon, I want to illustrate the intersections of language with privilege and race through 4 vignettes from my life in becoming a multilingual researcher who advocates for developing multilingual awareness in classrooms as the foundation for supporting all students' academic growth and social understanding of difference. It's not only multilingual speakers who need equitable access and support in schools. English dominant speakers have a critical role to play as multilingual allies. And with these next 4 vignettes, I illustrate how languages and the way we use them across different spaces shape not only how we're seen and positioned, but also how we come to see ourselves and others. So, next slide. This first vignette is brown dash. People have a terrible time trying to place me, even when I'm standing right in front of them. When I explain that I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, they persist in asking me what my background is and where I'm from. Really. This exchange has unfolded for as long as I've been able to speak for myself because I'm brown. I always use an M dash in writing it rather than a hyphen, meant as an artistic punctuation mark to evoke pause. I've always resisted hyphens as they feel subtractive to me, like a minus sign. I'm brown, M dash, multiracial, multicultural, and multilingual. I was born and raised in Toronto by my father, Chandrashwar Prasad, who had immigrated from Patna, India, and my mother, Marty Toyoko Yasunaka, a second generation Japanese Canadian. For my mother, the hyphen has always been important because she identifies as Japanese hyphen Canadian, making clear that she is not wholly Japanese, but even though she looks it, she is Canadian. She lost her Japanese language, though, along with her family's home and their possessions as a consequence of being interned with her family at Tashmi, Interior BC, during the Japanese internment in Canada during World War II, and the pressure to assimilate after the war. My mother's family never really talked about the internment when I was a child, so my early connection to my Japanese heritage was largely from associations I made with family celebrations, cultural events, and practices with other Japanese Canadians. While my parents spoke several languages, they raised me as a monolingual Anglophone in order to ensure my success in school. Following the advice of the school system, then, they wanted me to have greater opportunity and access to education than they had had. And they recognized that the cost of such access was our family's multilingual inheritance. They were successful in a sense because I graduated from university with an honors degree in English literature and a minor in French. I had an official degree that attested to my ability to use both official languages in Canada. Next slide. La Blanche. Moving on into my early days as a language teacher and then as a graduate student in comparative and international development and second language education, I had a number of opportunities to work with teachers and students in multilingual classrooms in both English and French schools in Canada and internationally. As part of my master's program, I traveled to Burkina Faso to support local teachers in teaching in French at an AIDS orphanage school where children came from 10 different regional communities, each with different languages spoken, in addition to Moray, one of the national languages of Burkina Faso. As a result of colonization by the French and according to national policy, K-12 education is conducted in French as the dominant language of instruction, at least on paper. Although my linguistic insecurity in French was high, I was reassured that upon arrival, I would be greeted by a Canadian team of nurses who were also on site, and they would help me get oriented. I arrived in Ouagadougou after several delays and a turbulent flight, and I felt green, both in the sense that the context was entirely new to me and because my stomach hadn't settled from the flight or the bumpy ride to the village where the orphanage and school were located. Still feeling queasy, I wanted to push through my fatigue, knowing jet lag would do me in if I went straight to bed. So I met with the director of the orphanage, who greeted me with a warm and jovial smile. He then began recounting the history of the orphanage in French with such passion and animation that it felt like I was drinking from a fire hydrant. My head began spinning, and just as he was about to finish, my stomach and the 22 hours of travel caught up with me. I stood up, knowing I was going to be sick, and I proceeded to vomit all over his shoes. I was mortified, and he simply burst into laughter, along with all the other staff who were in the room. I was not the first foreigner to toss her cookies shortly after arrival. One of the nurses was called to come and take me back to my sleeping quarters, and I feared that I might forever be known as the one who vomited all over the director. My fears, however, were quickly allayed as the days and the weeks unfolded, and I became known as La Blanche. Given that I had spent my entire life being brown in Canada, when I was called La Blanche, the white woman, in Burkina Faso, it made me question my identity. It also made me realize the power of language in shaping how we see ourselves and others. One afternoon, following work in a classroom, when students had referred to me repeatedly as La Blanche, I asked the teacher why I had been given that name, especially because I was not white. In a matter-of-fact way, he explained that I spoke English. It had nothing to do with my skin, in fact, though all of the Canadian nurses were in fact white. He assured me that they meant the name with affection because everyone was quite thankful that I actually spoke French and spent time talking with them and listening to them, unlike many foreign workers who came and only spoke English. In that context, my proficiency in English made me uncomfortably white. I struggled to wrap my head around how being called a white woman in French by Burkinabe locals could be a term of endearment. I felt like my brownness was being erased by language. And this early experience of international fieldwork raised my awareness of my positionality as an outside researcher in the field, as a complex entanglement of linguistic privilege, nationality, and racialization. I had not come prepared to engage such reflexive questions about my own identities. While I had entered the field feeling rather green, I became aware of how my linguistic privilege, speaking both Canada's official languages, had in a sense turned me white. This erasure was not a case of passing for white, but rather being ascribed an identity that I carried now rather hauntingly. Whereas I had been consumed with my overwhelming sense of linguistic insecurity prior to my trip due to my own self assessed limited French competence, my proficiency or lack thereof was overshadowed by the privilege of my Canadian nationality and the pervasive ideology of the whiteness of English. Linguistic privilege takes many forms because language is always entangled with multiple identity markers. Next slide. L'américain. As I continued into my PhD, my linguistic insecurity in French remained quite high. I think they teach it in schools. But um, I was thankful when I received a research fellowship to spend a year at the Université Paul Valéry in Montpellier, France. During that year in France, my brown skin and my heavy Anglophone accent raised new questions. When I was asked where I was from, I always explained that I was from Canada, and my response was typically met with some protestation. Mais non, vous n'avez pas l'accent canadien. Francophone, du Québec, plutôt américain. I would go on to explain that I was, in fact, not American, nor was I French Canadian, but rather an Anglophone from Toronto. With this clarification, While this clarification would typically be followed by an encouraging reply that I had learned French well for an Anglophone, it would invariably be followed by one further question asking where I was originally from. That is, my family's origins, and whether I spoke the languages associated with my family's cultural origins. Although I had grown accustomed to questions of my true cultural heritage while I was in Canada, I experienced a new form of unease being misidentified as an American by virtue of my Anglophone accent. As I observed in school classrooms, worked at the university, and tried to make myself at home in my rented flat off La Place de la Comédie in the old city center of Montpellier, I wrestled with how I felt at times that my skin color and my accent betrayed me, and at others, how it lent me a complex sense of legitimacy as a researcher. Students and teachers often expressed surprise to discover that I was a brown Anglophone Canadian who had learned French, however accented, but not my own languages. Admittedly, this reaction provoked my persistent sense of linguistic inadequacy. I didn't look like an Anglophone, but I couldn't speak any other brown languages either. Their surprise, however, was gradually tempered with understanding when they learned that my research focused on linguistic diversity in multilingual schools. Of course, it seemed to make sense to them at some level that I was an immigrant researcher studying multilingual immigrant students in France. I seemed to gain legitimacy as a researcher because I was investigating the experiences of children like myself. I was becoming aware in a new way of the ways in which language is interwoven into the fabric of our lives and cannot be separated from other identity markers. Languages live and flourish ultimately because of their users. Next slide. Black. Upon completing my PhD, I moved to the United States to take up my first academic position as a tenure-track professor at a research-intensive university. Although I had always identified as being part of a multiracial immigrant family, my move to the US as a relatively young parent raising a multiracial, multicultural, multilingual child prompted me to re engage with my questions about my identities in a deeper way. I had thought that I had reached a new relative level of comfort in my own skin. But as I was now navigating a new country and culture and school system with my son, um, I again sensed that I began to feel that sense of dis-ease. While I recognized that I was in some ways reliving my parents' story of immigration in a new country, I did so with the tremendous privilege of education, language, and relatively secure work. I could advocate for myself and for my child. And indeed, I had my parents' support My father's words behind me, or words to me when I accepted my position in the US were, Gail, everything I have ever sacrificed in leaving my family in India is worth it now that you've become a professor at such a good American university. Little did I know what was in store. My very first week on campus, as a newly hired professor, I was invited to join a support group for junior faculty of color. We would be reading throughout the year a book uh, called by Carrie Rockmore called A Black Academic's Guide to Winning Tenure Without Losing Your Soul. The invitation took me by surprise because I had never thought of myself as Black, and nor had I thought of Black as an inclusive category for people of color. I assumed that I would not necessarily be welcome or find a sense of belonging as a brown Canadian amongst a group of Black American academics. And while I longed to find my place in a new institution, in a new country, the lingering shadow of a personal sense of cultural liminality and linguistic illegitimacy continued to haunt me. I became aware that in that exchange, that even though I spoke English, I didn't sound or look or belong despite my linguistic proficiency. Next slide. I've wrestled through much of my childhood and young adult life with dwelling in the margins as a multiracial Indian Japanese Canadian, never quite feeling Indian enough or Japanese enough because I didn't speak the languages, and wondering whether I would ever be fluent enough to count in English or French to at least be a legitimate, officially bilingual Canadian. I didn't see myself represented, officially or unofficially. As a multilingual researcher and teacher educator today, I hear stories like my own on a regular basis from students, parents, and educators, both those who identify as English dominant speakers and those who identify as bi and multilingual and multiracial. For different reasons, experiences of linguistic doubt, shame, insecurity, and incompetence are common to every one of us, with many of the roots of these feelings stemming from school based experiences and assessments. Because the moment we open our mouths, we're classified and categorized as our words weave between the warped systemic norms and standards of what language or variety counts and whose languages have power. Next slide. My work has shown that awareness matters. Allyship begins with recognizing how linguistic diversity can weave Canadian society together rather than tear us apart. And the good news is that growth is possible for everyone. We can all expand our communicative repertoires, learn new languages, and build relationships across them. We can all become multilingual allies and activists, and each one of us has a role to play in weaving stronger, vibrant, thriving multilingual communities. Next slide. In the work that I've been doing in schools, I've identified 5 actions that we can take to engage in multilingual allyship and advocacy, even from a young age. We can first recognize our linguistic privilege when we speak the dominant language or sound like the majority. We can disrupt monolingualism as the norm by welcoming others to use their languages and leaning into communication across differences. We can also engage in multilingual risk taking, learning and using a few words in the languages of our neighbors, colleagues, and friends. And we can go a step further to actively engage in linguistic and cultural collaboration with others beyond our comfort zones, especially when teachers actively plan for collaboration in classrooms. And ultimately, we can be language advocates for linguistic justice and language maintenance and revitalization. These are 5 actions that each of us can take. And the last slide. Together, we can weave a stronger, more inclusive community by recognizing our linguistic privileges, disrupting monolingual norms, and engaging in multilingual risk taking together. We can create the tapestry that celebrates and supports the language richness that is here in Canada. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I just love the way you tell the story of your experience as well. And it stuck out to me as an African who has been educated and who's had sort of a similar journey as you've had.
Mm.
Um, the idea that they would say La Blanche. Do you know that even as a Black person, I would be called, La Blanche,
Yes.
or, you speak white,
Yes.
to denote that privilege. So when I'd like to get a sense of what the conversation is like when you are aware of your linguistic privilege and you're in a setting where other people sort of don't get what's going on. Like, what is I'm trying to phrase this correctly. What kind of language do you use? What is the conversation you'd be having?
Um, I think that this is um has been part of my life since I was a child because I grew up in a home where my parents spoke 5, 6, 7 different languages. And so we always had people in our home who spoke languages that I didn't speak, but I always spoke English. And so I think my parents had raised me as a young child to still listen. And I think we've heard that several times today, that listening before we speak is the priority. And
Mhm.
I think that's so true. And I work a lot in schools on talking with or working with teachers who say, I don't speak the languages that my students speak. So how can I do this? How do I give up, or not just give up, but share my linguistic privilege? And I said, I think it begins by being multilingual listeners. And there is a sense in which um, we automatically think if we don't speak someone's language, we aren't obliged to engage in communication with them. So we are allowed in society to exclude people based on their language, whereas we wouldn't accept that type of exclusion for other categories of difference. And so thinking that it's not just their responsibility to learn English, but I can do something to learn something about your language. And when we do so, we start building that bridge, and our stories become intertwined, because it's so powerful when someone reaches out to you and even says hello in your language. It's like they see you and you're willing to begin trusting. So I think it often starts by saying, I'm uncomfortable. Recognizing that I might be uncomfortable in this situation, but I can do hard things and I'm going to persist. And I think that um, is the starting place I work with in classrooms. And I think the same is true with adults, but we have a lot more linguistic insecurity as adults. We don't want to make mistakes. We don't want to be seen as less intelligent, which is often what people associate with not being able to communicate what we want to say. We say less. And so we have to recalibrate. And I think it very much is a paradigm shift from saying uh, proficient speakers are more valuable than multilingual speakers who move across their repertoires.
Mhm. Thanks for that. Is there a question? Because we're running out of time.
Mm.
So I just want to make sure someone had a really burning question in the chat. Amal, is there anybody? No, I'm not seeing anything.
Sorry, Sarah, I was activating my audio.
Oh,
We have Eliana saying how peer influence amongst the youth in particular, affects language learning motivation, and how this could be used to do exactly the opposite, like to make accents and languages actually cool again.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm excited actually to see the opportunity that we have with so many different languages in classrooms. And I do a lot of this work in teacher education to normalize bringing those languages into the classroom. And while I was in the US, I was working with a school district that had implemented a multilingual pedagogy across the curriculum from K to 5. And by the end of grade 5, students were celebrating the fact that they were learning other languages. And parents then came on board and said, it makes a difference that my child is this open. And I don't think that if they had not had this exposure explicitly, that they would be as ready to pursue other languages in middle school and high school, potentially in university when they have those opportunities for other language instruction. And I often say, I spent a lot of years learning French as a second language, and came out of my decade of French language learning feeling more linguistic insecurity than feeling linguistic proficiency. But if we had flipped the script and helped students develop linguistic curiosity from a young age, I think that there would be greater confidence in pursuing language learning.
Yeah, I like
Thank you.
the exposure, openness, awareness. I think we're going to have to end it there, unfortunately. But there's so many other questions I would have asked, and I'm very interested in that issue of accents, because that's how our children from the Caribbean and African communities get streamed, right, in school. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of our storytellers for their presentations. And as we end this session, I'd like to extend our gratitude to MCIS Language Solutions, the sponsor for today's event. Based in Toronto, this nonprofit organization has worked for over 35 years to eliminate language barriers and has developed into a notable social enterprise. And in recognition of language advocacy work across Canada, MCIS started an initiative in 2024 to award language advocacy microgrants. These grants support 3 grassroots initiatives that promote language access, preserve languages, and advance linguistic equity. The applications will open tomorrow, February 22nd, and will be available until March 31st. And links will be provided in the chat below, if we can get the links in the chat. And yeah, hopefully some of you who are in the session will consider applying for these micro grants. And thank you all. Well, first of all, thank you to MCIS for inviting me to moderate this. I learned a lot. And thank you for joining us for Language Advocacy Day 2025. Together we can make a difference, as all of our speakers reminded us. We can make a difference and ensure that language access is recognized as a right for all Canadians. Have an awesome day.